Hello, everyone. My name is Madiha Tahir, and I'm a Mellon postdoctoral fellow at ASU.
And hi, everyone. My name is Adrien Zakar, and I'm an assistant professor of history at the University of Toronto. We'll both be your moderators for today.
So before we get started today, we wanted to acknowledge that there's yet another war that has started, the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. As scholars and people with roots in the regions the US has devastated, and Russia as well in the past, we have watched the images from Ukraine with horror and sadness. We also want to note that the US wars are not over. In fact, just yesterday, the US drone bombed Somalia. Initial figures put the dead at 60 there. And this erasure and reworking of histories and narratives is, of course, some of what we'll be discussing today. We're very happy today to host Dr. Rosie Bashir, Dr. Zainab Bahrani, and Dr. Priya Satya as part of the second season of our continuing series, Technologies of Power, where we host a group of speakers every other week to discuss the multiple wars that have been waged over the last 20 years, many of them in the name of fighting, quote unquote, terror. And you can find the full recording of our last event on Afghanistan on our YouTube channel, and it will also be posted in the chat. Now, this adventure, Technologies of Power, began for us 2 years ago as we were thinking critically of the technological legacies of the war on terror. Since the turn of the 21st century in Africa, in South Asia, and in the Middle East, warmongering and the technologies upon which it rests have led to immense destruction. In part, growing out of this litany of material loss, new devices for knowing and framing the past and future have arisen. Drones, aerial sensing and mapping, mass digitization of texts, algorithmic machine reading, and the first 3D printers. In short, devices that trace us, but also that we can perhaps use to trace alternate pathways.
So in this second season, we consider various forms of critical praxis that could be said to have emerged in response to the critical concept and diagnostics of the technologies of power we discussed in our fall series. So today's event considers the question of traces. Traces left, traces to be found, traces as evidence, traces as marks, traces as heritage, and heritage as war. We perhaps all remember the spectacular destruction of Palmyra's Temple of Bel, which came as a symbol of the fate of many heritage sites across the region for the past 2 decades and more. The purposeful destruction of material traces of the past and their reconstitution worked as a powerful intervention into the political present. The opacity of the global war on terror that we've been exploring through the lenses of enclosure, aesthetics, and opacity tends to conceal traces left behind on multiple planes: physical, infrastructural, historical, and even digital. Yet, as our speakers today will show, when considering traces as a starting point to rethink knowledge production and material practices such as archaeology, heritage curation, and staging, well, we can start asking an interesting set of questions. First, what in the act of revealing traces of the past constitute a political gesture in the present? And second, what forms of resistance can be deployed when the traces have been removed and when there is no more trace? Technologies of power trace us, but how can we trace them? These will be the questions we'll be discussing today, but first we'll shortly introduce our speakers.
You can find the full biographies of our speakers posted in the chat, but I will introduce them briefly. Rosie Bashir is a historian of the modern Middle East. She is the author of Archive Wars, The Politics of History in Saudi Arabia from Stanford University Press, and the associate producer of the 2007 Oscar-nominated film, My Country, My Country. Zainab Bahrani is Edith Porada Professor of Art History and Archaeology at Columbia University and the author of Rituals of War from Zone and MIT Press in 2008, which won the American Historical Association Prize. And she's also the author of The Infinite Image, Art, Time, and Aesthetic Dimensions in Antiquity by the University of Chicago Press 2014. And finally, today we have Priya Satya, who is the Raymond A. Spruance Professor of International History and Professor of History at Stanford University, where she teaches modern British and British Empire imperial history. She is the author of 3 prize-winning books, including the last one called Time's Monster, How History Makes History in 2020, which was named as one of BBC History Magazine and the New Statesman's Best Books of 2020. Thank you so much for joining us today.
So let me explain how we're going to run today's event. Each speakers will have pre-recorded a talk, a brief presentation with us, and we will play all 3 videos first, and then open the floor for questions. Please note too that we encourage the panelists to engage each other's presentation, and we also encourage the audience to ask questions and post comments in the chat. We look forward to an engaging conversation afterwards, and we'll start with Rosie Bshir.
Hi everyone, my name is Rosie Bshir and I teach history at Harvard University. First of all, it's a pleasure to be part of this important conference. Thanks to the organizers for the invitation and for the flexibility in accommodating someone currently based in Beirut. My recent work has centered on the politics and materiality of history making and its relationship to modern statecraft. Today, I will talk about some of this work and how producing and territorializing a singular top-down historical narrative out of many entangled ones are belligerent but normalized acts of state formation. These are acts that necessarily rely on the destruction, containment, and silencing of the evidentiary terrain. In this sense, the state-sanctioned construction of the past is the continuation of war by other means. As networks of knowledge production and transmission, heritage sites are technologies of everyday violence that embody ongoing social relations and struggles over power. In times of peace, as in war, they are terrains of symbolic and material contestation, whose creative destruction can be deployed for political and economic reasons. Authorizing and constructing the past are therefore bureaucratized, everyday state efforts that normalize history through archives in the built environment, for legitimation purposes, for sure, but also to pacify political opponents, diversify national economies, and monumentalize state power. We can see examples of such dynamics everywhere, in the Standing Rock Reservation in North America, or in Istanbul, Mecca, and Tel Aviv in the Middle East. Much has been written about the antagonistic politics, constructed nature, and destructive tendencies of history writing and heritage making. Yet rarely do these bureaucratized, ubiquitous technologies of power evoke sustained and broad-based public outcries. If many across the world have been appalled by the transgressions of Islamist groups against statues, monuments, and historical spaces in Iraq, Syria, and Afghanistan, comparatively few seem to protest the simultaneous state destruction of heritage elsewhere. Let's take the case of contemporary Iraq as an example. Universal neglect of attacks against heritage there was flagrant, beginning with the first US war on Iraq in 1990. The US military inflicted extensive damage upon Iraq's cultural heritage during the so-called Operation Desert Storm. The US war, coupled with the catastrophic UN-brokered sanctions on Iraq, caused unprecedented damage to Iraq's material history. And with a thriving global market for antiquities from the region, the illegal trade in Iraqi cultural artifacts proliferated, with many ending up in places like Paris, London, New York. The deleterious effects of the 1990 Gulf War reverberated across the Middle East. In a place like Saudi Arabia, for example, the state quickly embarked on a multi-billion-dollar secular heritage industry in Riyadh, an industry that included museums, archives, and commemorative spaces. The regime sought to recreate an imagined past whose material traces had been all but demolished along Haussmannian lines in decades past. This heritage industry necessarily relied on the simultaneous mass destruction of historical as well as sacred space across the country. Space that countered official Saudi history, and this was most visible in Mecca, but it was also visible elsewhere in the country. These technologies of power and the overhaul of the Saudi political economic system they ushered took specific shape in response to the challenges of the 1990 Gulf War. One central challenge that led to these changes was the sustained domestic opposition that emerged, both to the war and to the stationing of thousands of US troops inside the country. And if you recall, the Saudi regime sided with the United States in its war against Iraq. The domestic Saudi opposition combined with the post-war global economic recession and exposed the Saudi regime's political, military, and economic weakness. One of the pillars of the regime's post-war responses was therefore to reconfigure its power based on historical revisionism and commemoration. Archives, museums, and commemorative spaces became technologies of knowledge production, of state formation, and of infrastructural power that aimed to territorialize national history, pacify wartime opposition, and create new economic value in the built environment. Breaking with the past, or attempting to occlude its multiple traces, is a common feature of modern state formation. The modern state, imperial or otherwise, often necessitates the selective erasure of certain histories and the incompatible truth and socialities they mobilize, and then replacing them with modes of being and remembering that correspond to the modern state form. In the case of Saudi Arabia, the US Oil Corporation, or Aramco, and US bureaucrats were central to aligning these incompatible histories from both Saudi and US historiographies and archives. This is, of course, in addition to aiding in defeating Saudi Arabia's oppositional movements at various points since the 1940s. In any case, and despite all this, states and imperial projects of heritage making often receive global recognition from international media outlets and multilateral institutions, recognition that perpetuates an understanding of historical preservation as an apolitical and technocratic process, an enlightened global public good, if you want. This is as true of the the New York Times as it is of UNESCO. Not only are these institutions largely silent on the contentious construction of heritage in places such as Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the United States, but they also ultimately serve to legitimize them. Historians and other scholars turned detectives are left to search for traces that may have survived these acts of destruction, a search made harder by the ever-improving and deepening technologies of destruction, as well as state and imperial efforts to police the production and transmission of knowledge. I have therefore come to think of archives and commemorative spaces as sites of war that embody and reflect inter- and intra-state struggles and state-society struggles over power. The post-September 11 US invasion and occupation of Afghanistan and Iraq, and the world that ushered in, make that very clear. Under the guise of the so-called global war on terror, states around the world increased investments in technologies of policing knowledge production and crushing domestic opposition, all, of course, in the name of fighting terror. We saw that in Egypt, we saw that in Syria, we saw that in the United States. This was definitely the case in Saudi Arabia, which, in addition to mass arrests in the aftermath of 2001, saw an accelerating wave of mass demolitions of heritage sites. Traces of these arrests, traces of this destruction, are becoming harder to ascertain, even for those of us who have experienced and were embroiled in these practices in the years after the 9/11 attacks. Let me go back to heritage as a site of war. US imperial forces used history and heritage as political tools to subjugate the Iraqi people. In the first weeks of the 2003 war, the US military and political leaderships refused to safeguard Iraq's cultural properties. While the US government was at once downplaying the looting that occurred and justifying it, its officials were planning the transfer of millions of Iraqi archival documents and various artifacts to the United States. Mere months later, reports poured in claiming that US troops were ordered not to intervene in the looting of archives and monuments, and were actively encouraging such theft. The reports showed that the cultural cleansing that took place was central to the US imperial agenda in Iraq. It was an instrument of war through which the US government attempted to defeat Iraq, subjugate its people, and erase its history, some of which, of course, implicates the United States in processes such as, or events such as the Iran-Iraq War, or the massacres that Saddam Hussein committed against Iraqis. Researchers estimated that the US military stole about 89% of the former regime's documents in the first few months of the occupation. So extensive was the damage to Iraq's heritage, so prevalent the sale of cultural property, that by 2005, the UK World Monument Fund unprecedentedly designated the entire country of Iraq as an endangered site. Yet beyond the initial media frenzy, the US government received little criticism outside of scholarly and preservationist circles for the plundering of Iraqi archives and the damage its invasion and occupation inflicted upon Iraq's heritage. The same can be said of similar practices by other regimes, both domestically and otherwise. And you can think here of Israeli practices across historic Palestine, but also in Lebanon, UK practices across the country and in the UK's former colonies. And we can think about Saudi practices domestically, but also in Yemen, where Saudi and Emirati-led coalition forces deliberately targeted 78 cultural and archaeological sites that are confirmed, among many others that are still not reported, of course using US-made bombs. This starkly contrasts with the global condemnation of the theft and destruction of heritage committed by the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, or Taliban. This is to say nothing of media outlets and preservationist agencies ultimately framing the destruction of material history only by terrorist groups as more tragic and reprehensible than the loss of life, or rather, I should say, the loss of presumably Muslim life. This is a reality that many in the colonial and post-colonial worlds have long had to contend with, and one that has been increasingly familiar since the September 11 attacks. Journalist complicity with state and imperial power runs deeper and is structural to 21st century technologies of power. Here we can think of the embedded journalism of the United States' 21st century wars. We can also think of the discovery in 2013 that US news organizations agreed to remain silent for 2 years about the existence of a secret US drone base in Saudi Arabia. The base's exact location remains unconfirmed. We have traces of it appearing on some GIS tools, but not the most popular ones. Say Google, for example, and others, which usually have mega contracts with the US government. The US has been using this secret drone base to launch attacks in Yemen, sometimes against US targets, all in the name of national security. And it has unsurprisingly refused to divulge any information about this and other bases, also, of course, in the name of national security. The bureaucratic practices I'm describing, whose technologies are regularly transferred between states, are normalized pillars of modern statecraft, from the construction and destruction of history and heritage to the policing of knowledge production in general. That a central aim of these practices is to obscure the violence on which state and imperial formation relies, and to then repurpose it in the service of the state, only foregrounds the importance of traces to the historian's craft, and to uncovering these everyday forms of state violence that many of us have come to accept. Thank you for listening.
In a meeting at the UN Security Council in February 2003, the US Secretary of State, Colin Powell, presented intelligence from satellite images as proof that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Though we now know that the information gathered from those images was wrong, the following month, the war on long-term occupation of Iraq began. And as my colleague Laura Kurgan has said, it was partly based on the idea of the infallibility of such an image and the technology that produced it. My research in the history of art and archaeology explores the history of the image, the practices of mimesis, and philosophies of representation. From the other side of history, in the distant past, the ancient Babylonians and Assyrians understood that reality and representation were interdependent, and also that technologies of the image were among the technologies of war. Images and maps were also central to the success of the 19th century imperial colonial mission in the Middle East, in which archaeology participated. The topics I want to discuss in the context of this series of the humanities talks and methodologies have to do with the ways in which archaeology is at once implicated in and can read against and challenge the new technologies of power. I will begin with mapping. Some now speak of the militarization of archaeology as a discipline, its embeddedness within the aims of war and occupation, its new dependence on forms of remote sensing and geospatial mapping that, like aspects of warfare today, also involve experts who work remotely from distant computer screens. But since its earliest days, mapping has been one of the main activities of archaeologists and Orientalists in Iraq, which is ancient Mesopotamia. Though the militarization of archaeological practice is perhaps clearer now, as drones and digital technologies that were developed for the military, and some of them first used for reconnaissance and smart bombing in Iraq during the first Gulf War in 1991, are now commonly used by archaeologists. Like colonial-era cartography, these new technologies can provide great accuracy, but they also raise a number of questions about scopic regimes and formations of viewership. How are we to read this new scientific archaeological view from nowhere? What is the position of the viewer as subject? How does the image express its authority? And how does the aspect of temporality come into play within such images that are tagged geospatially and temporally? Art historians and historians of science have asked these kinds of questions in relation to earlier eras of imperialism. My work addresses how today, with archaeology's increasing reliance on declassified spy images such as CIA Corona satellites, remote sensing, and so on, we seem to be returning to the idea of the possibility of an unmediated representation. I am interested in ontologies of the image and of scientific images and the epistemological claims that they make, and also in how the subject position of archaeologists, to some extent, comes to be constructed by these images and is implicated in their forms of viewing and in the gazes that they generate. How does this new form of visual information and imaging develop for warfare, this exacting digital measurability of place or monument, erase its own representational apparatus? In the 19th century, Orientalist paintings were produced in a way as a way of knowing what was purported to be the reality of the exotic and decadent Orient. The paintedness of them was denied by means of the very processes of their painting, as the art historian Lyndon Auckland pointed out so brilliantly in 1983. The forms of exactitude without interpretation that military technologies have given archaeology also produce their own effects. The second related topic is collecting, Collecting antiquities involves the dislocation and disruption of object relations in assemblages and repositioning in forms of display. As such, colonial collecting practices are inscribed in techniques of power. This was not just a taking of symbolic capital of the antique that could be amassed in one place, like the movement of statues of the gods in antiquity, but it is directly related to landscapes and people. The removal of monuments and forced movements of populations often go hand in hand, so that Cyrus the Persian king's decree, which permitted displaced populations to return home in the 6th century BC, also included the restitution of statues. Looting of archaeological sites for the global antiquities market can now be tracked with satellite images so that we can see and document the devastation of the land for the illicit trade in heritage commodities. The techniques of power into which collecting is inscribed and participates in have to do with environments and with landscapes, but they also have to do with the writing of histories and the narratives that are told in museum displays and in texts. While coloniality was the condition that permitted both early archaeology and the 19th century collecting practices, which allowed the Encyclopedic Art Museum to come into existence, a similar situation and condition is the context that permits both looting and the new archaeological technologies in Iraq. This brings me to the third aspect, which is narrating. All of these technologies, GIS mapping, remotely sensed data, and reliance on declassified military satellite images, are a means of representing and managing data, and so of narrating and display that involve the archaeological sciences. The writing out of the subject position of the observer in archaeological work then also impacts the writing of the historical account. Aerial imaging elevates the eye of the archaeologist so that archaeology is reconceptualized as a distance view, which in some ways is the direct opposite of traditional field work, but also involves the older methods of digging in the ground in areas that are pinpointed by that view. The view from above, remote sensing, and so on are also mediated by the technological military lens itself. Archaeologists have not given much thought to these aspects of their military technologies that were developed in some cases for targeting and smart bombing Iraq itself. On the other hand, several artists have been critically engaging with these new relations of spy satellites, drone imaging, warfare, and archaeology using technologies in reversed ways. And in our Columbia project, Mapping Mesopotamian Monuments, we also turn away from standard methods. Rather, we are using these same new technologies to map a different kind of archaeological encounter, one that is phenomenologically tied to the landscape and which maps the multi-temporal historical relationships of living populations and monuments and ancient sites and antiquities that have been, in many cases, forcibly removed and appropriated for lucrative global markets in cultural heritage and for encyclopedic museums. We work in a transdisciplinary way. I've now started a new collaborative project with the Iraqi artist Henna Maalallah, tracing the links between colonialism and archaeology, repurposing technologies of power in a way that works more like bricolage, turning them to the service of exposing the destruction of war and colonial violence. To conclude, I would like to direct your view to a work of art. In a fascinating work by Henna Maalallah, we see an encounter between a drone and an ancient Sumerian ziggurat temple tower. There you will see that the all-encompassing and masterful view of the drone is countered by the enduring and monumental force of the ancient ziggurat.
Hi, I'm Priya Satya, and I'm from Stanford University, where I'm a professor of history and the Raymond Esperance Professor of International History. And my keyword is trace. So on 9/11, I was in the British Library doing research for my dissertation on the British invasion of Iraq during World War I. I then wrote the dissertation in the shadow of the conversation that led to the invasion of Iraq in 2003. The traces of those events were all over my dissertation, which explained how paranoia about intelligence failure in an Oriental land led to the British invention of aerial policing in the Middle East in the era around World War I. More importantly, I saw traces of that British era all over the joint American and British action in Iraq and Afghanistan in my own time. The same tropes about the Arab mind, the same perception of an unknowable place and faith in an aerial strategy. This was no coincidence, but the result of the passing down of those ways of thinking. American military and intelligence institutions actively learned from British experience after the First World War. Even as the British were launching aerial control in Iraq, the US was terrorizing Haitian villages from the air in what one US Marine memorialized as Black Baghdad. In 1921, private aircraft brought that aerial violence to Black Americans in Tulsa. As the US became involved in the Middle East from the 1930s, they also turned to British Arabist experts for their expertise. When they collaborated in covert Cold War operations with the British, the CIA's Middle East desk was manned by Kermit Roosevelt Jr., who was the son of a veteran of the British invasion of Iraq in World War I. And of course, T.E. Lawrence's work remains standard training for American Special Forces today. Myths of successful British air control have also been perpetuated in American military journals. So with all this, the Pentagon began to dream from 2003 itself of replacing American troops with air power. And the naming of today's Reaper drones dropping Hellfire missiles also bears traces of the British defense of aerial policing as an enactment of the will of God that people in a biblical land expected to endure. Now, American drone activity also builds on earlier American involvement in the region. The CIA ran the first drone strike in Afghanistan in 2002 at precisely the spot where President Clinton had ordered strikes in 1998, followed by more in 2001. And that 2002 drone strike wound up hitting poor people who were scavenging at that site for saleable metal fragments left over from those earlier bombardments. So we effectively have been bombing traces of our earlier bombings. Now, the Britons in the earlier era that I studied as a historian were also searching for traces. British archaeologists who became wartime experts on the Middle East came to the region in search of traces of the ancient origins of occultism, which was an intensifying European interest at the time. Traces of that interest can in turn be found in their development of aerial photography and their conviction that this otherworldly region could sustain violence that would be intolerable elsewhere. The book based on my dissertation, Spies in Arabia, came out in 2008. As I watched the U.S. consolidate its aerial strategy for a war on terror in precisely the same places, Afghanistan, Iraq, Somaliland, Yemen, where the British had invented aerial policing, I began to speak and write about these traces and explain the mythical nature of claims of British success to illuminate the dangers of such a strategy, not least because of its victims' memory of the earlier British episode. It seemed imperative to do so given the secrecy around the expanding drone program. The US government does not share even basic information about the use of drones, removing them from the check of American public opinion. Secrecy also enhances their terrorizing effect in the places where they are used, including the US, where last year drones were used to police Black Lives Matter protests. Mere traces of inhumane drone use are not enough, unfortunately, to sustain persistent demand for public accountability. In 2003, because of my work on aerial policing, I was invited on a Stanford Scholars Tour of U.S. Air Force bases in Nevada, including Creech Air Force Base, where the drones in the Middle East are remotely piloted. I was the only non-white member of the tour. I was asked to perform a strike against a fictional person in Kabul on a simulator used for training. I saw my mother's birthplace, Multan, in today's Pakistan, within striking distance, a trace of my own family's past. In 1919, in fact, British aerial policing had extended to my paternal grandmother's home in Gujranwala, which is also nearby to Kabul. This family past informs my perception of American military action in Asia today as much as my scholarly investigation of colonialism. The servicemen at the airbase high-fived me after my successful simulated strike against the region of my ancestors. I wrote about the connections between British colonial bombardment and our current drone strategy for a 2014 article in the journal Humanity. As it incorporated impressions from my tour, for which there was no clearly articulated policy around confidentiality, I took care to clear my draft with the tour coordinators. They asked me to remove most references to the tour, allowing only traces to remain. I complied, but despite this due diligence, the administrator at the Hoover Institution office that coordinated the tour accused me of endangering the security of our servicemen. This was of a piece with the broader post-9/11 trend of questioning the Americanness of those with traces of otherness, the blacklisting and spying and worse perpetrated against Muslims and those who read as Muslim. In 2011, the Department of Homeland Security had blacklisted my 3-year-old because of his Arabic-derived name, Kabir, which we chose because it is a trace of religious syncretism. It refers to the 15th century Indian poet mystic Kabir, who is dear to Muslims, Hindus, and Sikhs. How darkly ironic that such a name would entangle a toddler in a bigoted security apparatus incapable of conceiving of syncretism. Kabir is now on a list of formerly blacklisted Americans, permanently bearing the trace of being designated other. The Hoover Institution administrator also refused to share the photograph that the tour group had been asked to pose for in front of the hunter-killer drones, on the understanding that we would receive copies. She buried that trace of the presence of scholars at a military site designed to operate without public scrutiny. The tour was a PR exercise, like the British Air Ministry's propaganda efforts in the 1920s, aimed at promoting a myth of a successful, humane aerial strategy, and I had not cooperated. The editor of the journal Humanity, where my article appeared, learned from that article as he wrote a book on the history of the effort to make war more humane, but barely a trace of my work appears in his citations on the legacies of British aerial policing, its own kind of violence. My own work continues to bear traces of my dissertation project. The policing of armed Middle Eastern anti-colonialism reappeared in my 2018 book on the gun trade, Empire of Guns. And my latest book, Time's Monster, picks up on the role of historians in the British Middle East and the story of Edward Thompson, a colonial missionary who became disillusioned with empire while participating in the British invasion of Iraq in World War I, and who sought atonement through history writing, laying the groundwork for his son, E.P. Thompson's work on History from Below. My next work will revisit the geography of my simulated drone kill to uncover buried histories of colonial Punjab. Meanwhile, the challenge that covert aerial policing posed to Britain's democracy remains our problem today. Traces of the War on Terror's destructive power appear in the most disturbing episodes of American politics. The attackers on the Capitol in January this year included veterans of that war. Like most terrorizing violence in the U.S. today, including mass shootings by men with military-style firearms, this one was perpetrated by white Americans committed to racist and bigoted ideologies encouraged after 9/11. it was also enabled by a security state obsessively focused on plots being hatched abroad. The US now plans to pull out of Afghanistan while leaving covert traces of an American presence behind, a certain provocation to continued unrest there and undermining of democracy here. Yes, wars over there encompass struggles over here, over race, gender, and history, and vice versa. There are not clear boundaries between foreign and domestic, abroad and home. In Britain, right now, a culture war around traces of the imperial past makes clear the stakes of puncturing myths about the empire. A trace is a mark of the past's lingering presence in the present, its contemporaneity with the present, its continual presence. Each of us carries traces of the past that produced us, and the world we live in preserves traces too, as even the climate contains traces of all human actions over time. A trace is what is left after erasure, evidence of that which we have otherwise forgotten. This knowledge affects how we think about the discipline of history, our methods for dealing with temporality. It is a reminder of the coeval nature of past, present, and future, how in writing the past, we are constituting the present and shaping the future, how in searching for the past, we seek understanding of the present and alternatives for the future, how the temporality of our individual lives as students of the past is bound up in that quest, which leaves its spiraling traces on our past, present, and future. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. Allow me to start with the first question that's meant to open it up, get the ball rolling, and perhaps provoke you into talking a little bit more about yourselves. Our first question is with regards to the nature of traces themselves. So, tracing traces is in many ways the historian's craft or the archaeologist's craft. Now, all of you sort of told us about Rosie. You conducted research in an authoritarian repressive state. Zainab, you talk about the phenomenological depth of your relationship to artifacts, and Priya, you draw this ontological art from climate to your own intimacy. Can you tell us more how you became a tracer of traces? And can you tell us more of your relationship to this craft, and how has it changed since 9/11, more precisely? The first one who wants to start, I'll give the mic. Rosie, would you like to go? Yeah. Oh.
I was gesturing to my panelists, colleagues.
Oh, I would be happy to start. This is very easy for me to answer, in fact. And first of all, if you don't mind, I would just like to say thank you so much to both Rosie and Priya, because both of your talks were fantastic, and really appreciate what you said. In many ways, I feel as though when Rosie started to speak, I felt as though she was telling the story of my life. And then, of course, Priya added to it. So in a way, this is a good way to explain how I became interested in traces. So when I was a graduate student was the time of the first, the lead up to the first Gulf War. And so just as I finished my dissertation, the first Gulf War started. So everything that I did in my field after that had to do with what America was doing in Iraq, obviously. And then beyond that, of course, we all saw what happened with 9/11 and the Iraq war and the war in Afghanistan. But being Iraqi, of course, I was much more involved with things that occurred as a result of the American invasion of Iraq. So I was there in 2003 and 2004, right at the beginning, and I saw all of the destruction and all of the violence and all the horror. And that's why I'm telling you, it's as if you're telling the story of my life. And while already in 2003, as I was kind of running from place to place, seeing what was happening, it occurred to me that something had to be done to write about this, to record this, because the official stories were never going to be telling what I saw. And at that time, I decided that I had to kind of keep track of these traces. I'm not the only one. There are other Iraqi scholars, archaeologists, art historians who did this. Neda Shabut, who you had on previously, and the artist Hana Malala, who I mentioned. In fact, I would like to draw all of your attention to her website, Hana Malala. I think it's hanamalala.com or something like that. And on that website, we've started a project that we've been working on together. We're writing blogs, joint authored by Hana and myself. And one of them has been about traces, the traces of tanks and other military vehicles on archaeological sites. And we've recorded them from two different perspectives, Hana as an artist and myself as an archaeologist. So taking it quite literally and looking at military vehicles leaving their traces on historical places.
Others? Maybe I can just jump in with a Priya, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I mean, mine, yeah, I actually, thank you so much, Zainab and Rosie. And it's lovely to meet you both too this way. Yeah, I mean, just because there's a little bit of an intersection with what Zainab said, I wrote an essay about how I became a historian for H. Diplo, for those who are interested. And I just opened it to see what did I say there. And you know, it's, I mean, I'm the daughter of immigrants, but I'm also the daughter and granddaughter of refugees and people who were affected by the partition of British India in 1947. And so it was like growing up with the traces of another place, you know, growing up in California with the, you know, steeped in traces of another way of life that's from another place, but then also, you know, in my mother's family, for instance, finding traces of a part of Punjab that's not in the India that they inhabit, the language they speak, the dishes they make, things they would refer to, their family business, everything was like from another place. And then in my father's hometown in Indian Punjab, there was like this masjid across the street from the house that was empty, and it's beautiful. And it was like, again, this trace of a way of life in this town that was gone. And then after this paragraph in my historian, in that essay I wrote, the next sentence is the start of the Persian Gulf War. As you said, Zainab, was triggered this, my first attempt to blah, blah, blah. So like, it was again, this is a trace of a colonial practices that we've already seen that, but that going back to what Rosie said, our own state, you know, consistently erases this history. And so you always have to kind of excavate it all over again. And I was in high school at the time, and that was very pivotal for me, that I come from a colonized background, and the US is now doing exactly what the British did in the same places. So I'll just stop there.
This has been really, really amazing, and it's very tough to follow these acts. I would agree that the Persian Gulf in particular, I think, was a very pivotal moment. I grew up in Lebanon, and can you not hear me?
We can hear you.
I'm getting some signs that people can't hear me. But so growing up in Beirut, seeing the effects of the Persian Gulf War, the various Gulf Wars, was a pivotal moment for me, but I cannot speak to the pre-9/11 because I was not a historian prior to 9/11. But I had just moved to the US a couple of years prior, and I was caught up in the wave of harassment and arrests. A lot of my friends were arrested at the time, or in fact were disappeared for several months at a time. The special registration process that male Arabs and or Muslims had to go through, this all, I think, politicized me in a way. And at the time, I should say, where I was starting to learn more about Saudi Arabia. So I think this takes us into a different kind of conversation. At the time that this was going on in the US, I started to learn about different histories of Saudi Arabia through looking at traces, and to pick up on what Priya said earlier, traces in people, right? I started hearing about these secular movements of the mid-20th century Saudi Arabia, about leftist movements, communist movements, socialist movements from a first-person account. And that counters most of the things I had read in books. So it gave me, I pursued these traces to understand what it was that actually happened in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. And to my surprise, the history we have there and what actually happened countered a lot of what is still prevalent in the scholarship today. And as I mentioned in my talk, I did feel like I was a detective because of the counter popular movements, the counter-revolutionary movements that occurred at the time in the 20th century, not just in Saudi, but across the global South. It was very difficult to find a lot of these records. A lot of the people had passed by then. So it was finding traces of it literally around the world, just looking at this particular Saudi moment. Traces in Riyadh, in Mecca, and other parts of Saudi Arabia, but also in Bahrain, in Kuwait, in Egypt, in Lebanon, in France, the UK, and in the United States. To be able to come up with, it's always partial, but this partial history of these movements. At the same time, I was caught up in the 2006 war in Lebanon, the Israel war in Lebanon in 2006. And I was part of a making of a documentary film where what was striking was how people who were displaced, hundreds of thousands of people who were displaced, we had interviewed hundreds of them, how they were caught up in this international global discourse on the war on terror, and how they sort of positioned themselves in that particular US-centric narrative. And instead of talking about the actual war and what was happening, many of the people were sort of defending themselves as not terrorists, unprompted. There was no prompt towards that at all. We were trying to understand their experiences and how they had lived the multiple Israeli wars, but yet all they would talk about was, again, the US war on terror. So I think all of these things have fed into how I look at history and the craft and the importance of traces, again, not just in material world, but also in people and these technologies that travel from one place to the other.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you for these wonderful answers. And they really remind us of, in a sense, how we formed that group to start with. It was about Iraq. Like, Iraq represents something very unique in your all three's life trajectories, historical arguments, and career as a researcher. And so this is also part of, like, meditating a little bit on the meaning of Iraq, the meaning of 2003. Indeed, like, this is part of major time for me when I got politically active, right? And so this is really your first answers were really brilliant because they reminded us of, like, why we brought you three together in the first place. Priya, you mentioned you had a question for Rosie?
Sure. Yeah, and just on picking up what you were said, what you just said. Yeah, I was in the archives, 2001 when this 9/11 happened, and writing about Iraq, and it was just uncanny, the timing. So I can't imagine being a historian. That was when I was becoming a historian, without that backdrop and that the stakes that created for everything I was trying to do as a historian. My question, I had a question for you, Rosie. I really enjoyed your talk, and I was thinking of, the last chapter of Benedict Anderson, which I had occasion to reread lately, in which she talks about, nations, not the state, but how nation states basically require a certain form of forgetting, and as part of creating a kind of collective national memory. And the instances he brings up like a medieval massacre in France and how that gets written over, and the Civil War in the United States and how that's treated. It's the Civil War, not like part of the country seceding. And it's like forgetting that and rewriting it as a war within the nation, so it doesn't disrupt the long trajectory of the nation. And so what you were saying was reminding me of that. And then I was thinking that it's part of the problem that when we're talking about the modern state, we're talking about a set of institutions, a set of like a norm of what that is, that's completely derived from the modern history of imperialism, right? And so do you think it's possible to imagine state structures that don't require that kind of, for which, you know, this kind of forgetting or erasing of history and the plurality of histories is not, you know, integral to its establishment? And like when we think of processes like truth and reconciliation, for instance, do those open up a possibility for state structures that cease to do that kind of erasing or that recover from it? Or just what are the alternative possibilities? Or can we imagine other kinds of state structures or governing structures? Just curious what you thought of that.
Yes, thank you, Priya. I always say that I'm a historian. I just talk about what happened in the past. I have no idea how to propose alternative ways of being. As far as, you know, the modern state, I can't imagine a scenario where that is not part of the technologies of state making. You know, I laughed when you said truth and reconciliation, because in a different life, I was part of a couple of these efforts. And from my experience, it was precisely premised on forgetting. Right? You could not look at the past anymore. We had to move beyond it. There are different ways of looking at reconciliation and truth efforts, but the ones I was involved with literally were based on that. You simply could not talk about the past. Injuries were made, you know, we cannot focus about that. How can we coexist in the future? In my work, I talk about amnesia and destruction as history. Right? It's through understanding and excavating what forgetfulness is, what amnesia is, what was actually destroyed, that you can start to get an idea about what actually happened in the past. So again, in my understanding of the modern state, these things go hand in hand. And perhaps to imagine a different alternative would be to imagine an alternative to the modern state.
Right, that's what I meant. Like, can we imagine? So we can imagine one. I mean, we have to imagine one, basically, right? And maybe that's one of our tasks as historians. If our job is like truth-telling against the state, knowing that this is how the state operates, then implicit in that, maybe, according to what you're saying, is an assumption that we are imagining an alternative, right? There's some utopian version of the state in which we are redundant. I don't know.
Maybe imagining a utopian alternative is one thing, but imagining a somewhat possible alternative is another, because it's the same as trying to imagine post-capitalism and how difficult that is. You know, many have tried to imagine the post-state, the post-nation state, and look at where we are.
Yeah, I mean, utopian means, we would never actually get it, but it's supposed to we're supposed to want to get it.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe one of the things, just riffing on this conversation, is the question of, you know, the different kinds of relationships that states have had to history. And I'm wondering whether you can, each of you, talk a little bit about kind of the way in which, for instance, the United States has a particular kind of relationship to histories and archives. There's perhaps a continuation, but also shifting from prior kind of notions. I'm thinking here, for instance, you know, after 9/11, Richard Armitage, who was then Deputy Secretary of State, he was in a conversation with an Pakistani intelligence chief from the ISI, who was trying to explain to him the kind of origins of the Taliban. And Armitage basically cut him off and said, and I'm quoting, he said, "No, the history begins today." So this kind of entire sort of erasure, which I think in some ways I sense a kind of special kind of disdain for history within the US, but maybe this is not accurate. So I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about this, these kinds of relationships.
Well, I mean, I'll just say here, like, it's, you know, from the beginning of from the 18th century origins of our modern idea of history, there's been a tension, right, between this idea that, you know, like Thomas Paine even says, every generation has the right to remake their institutions, whatever the past is, right? And then Burke and he have a dispute about this, right? And then you can leap forward in like the 19th century, you have someone, and these are very different thinkers, I'm not saying they're all the same. Like you get to the 19th century and you have someone like Nietzsche, who's saying, you know, the abuse of history, that we are always making excuses about history, you know, we're stuck in a certain way, and the point is to make this leap in the dark and free yourself from history in order to make new history, right? So that's been like a legacy of, you know, the European philosophy of history, in tension always with this idea, you know, I guess there's like the more revolutionary version of that, and then there's like the more Whiggish version, which is you continually make change, but within the bounds of existing institutions and traditions, right? Which would be like Macaulay would say, or Burke would say, or something like that. This is very schematic. So this is like, but because of colonialism, this way of thinking about history has been propagated everywhere. So states everywhere do this, including like the Indian state today and its attitude towards the past and completely erasing entire past of entire communities, right? I mean, so that's what, going back to what we were saying earlier, all states are today, nation states have that imperial kind of prerogative to them that's itself a legacy of the recent colonial past. They're post-colonial states, and the United States is also a post-colonial state. Maybe it's the oldest post-colonial state, right? So, and it's built, you know, on this revolutionary moment in which it was like, we are breaking bonds and creating anew. So I don't know if it is definitely strong in the United States, that mentality, but in the way that everything is referred to, like the Constitution and originalism, you see the opposite trend, right? In which, no, we should never break from the past. So these two things are always in tension. And I think it's a matter of politics and convenience, you know, which one gets highlighted at certain moments. And that's kind of what, you know, my book Times Monster is about, exactly like when do we reach for which of those versions of what should be our attitude towards history. I hope that helps.
Yes, definitely.
I would just add a couple of points to that. I mean, I completely agree with everything that you all said about utopianism and the need to at least hope for the possibility of change, even if in the face of, you know, complete pessimism about how states are today and erasures of history and displacements of populations and so on. But as an academic, I think that I see my role, and I don't know about the rest of you, or at least I think it's more realistic to think in terms of what we can do inside academia. Because as I think both Rosie and Priya kind of suggested, there is a slight problem with academia itself, and that we're not just talking about state power, we're talking about academics who support the apparatuses of power through what they write, through appearing as talking heads, through advising, whatever. And so I think that within academia itself, we can, I mean, in archaeology, this is a serious problem, which is what I was trying to get out in my talk, that archaeologists are in many ways completely complicit with what happened in Iraq. And although they may see themselves as rescuers of heritage, they were in many ways quite the opposite. And I would say the same happens today. So I think that we have to ask ourselves what we can do within our own fields and within academia to make a change. I mean, even on the very most practical level, often when one tries to submit an article or make a statement that's in any way critical, it's not received very well. So there are still kinds of unspoken parameters out of which you're not allowed to move. And so I think that we have to make a noise there, because what I find really reprehensible is how we have rewritings of history in support of state power that are actually being supplied by academics, and academics who probably know very well that what they're writing is nonsense, simply in order to make a name for themselves. So to me, this is a bigger problem within our fields. I mean, I doubt very much that, Biden is ever going to listen to me or whoever, but I hope that we can make some changes within academia to say, no, you have to listen to our points of view. You can't just keep repeating the same thing.
I really like that idea, and the role of the academic in this, and some of the institutions that we all belong to, and how they actually legitimate these state histories, and how we continue to invite these same people to regurgitate these same kinds of history. And I would add to that the flip side, and the attempts of different governments and regimes to influence knowledge production across the world through influencing, presses, publishers, media, cinema as of late as well in places like Saudi Arabia. And this is also precisely why when I talk about, the study of history making as a way to understand the state, which goes back to what you were saying, Priya, about the particular moment and the politics of the moment, and what is acceptable at a particular time and not acceptable later on. And there are these big debates happening in Saudi Arabia right now, where in the last few weeks, in fact, the accepted top-down official historical narrative was just altered, which wouldn't have been imagined 10 or 20 years ago. And so now the rulers just came in and altered that particular narrative and the teleology of it. And again, as with this kind of writing of history, what is relied on is the passage of time, right? We know this now, but in 20 years, we will have forgotten and traces of it will have disappeared. And I should say to Zainab that I really hope that your books and the circulation of your books and the awards should be evidence that you are doing this kind of work. And even if it pisses off some historians.
No, I'm sorry to butt in again, but I just want to point out that yes, full professorship, awards for all my books, accolades, this prize and that prize, they don't really seem to help. And so I'm just going back again to my work with Hannah. And you may ask why a tenured professor at Columbia would want to, in her, later part of her career, decide to become a kind of a pseudo artist, basically because I felt cornered into it. It was the only way that I could really express myself, because things that I wanted to say could not be said otherwise. And I'm really grateful to Hannah because she gave me this opportunity to work with her so that I could express these things which could not, or were not permitted, let me say, in an academic context. So I went in the direction of art practice instead.
That's actually really illuminating, that moving towards art. I want to get back to that. So yes, I mean, the entire history of the historical discipline is that it was always, in the British case, I'm going to talk about, always allied with what the state needed. And so you have historians as policymakers, architects of empire. You can think of someone like Macaulay, you can think of someone like Churchill, you can think of James Mill. I mean, this is the story of empire, is the story of the historical discipline also. And then it's supposed to have changed somewhat, or different ways of doing history, history from below, talking back to the state, all of that, anti-colonial history, anti-racist history, feminist history, all these things emerged, right, as you get through the 20th century. But the problem is that the academy that employs us was institutionally always, the site of where, policies and advocacy for empire was taking place. And if you'll notice, the minute people who look like us are getting endowed chairs and professorships at prestigious universities, there's an attack on universities, right? Because it can't sustain them, because the university as a system is designed to abet power. And here we are undermining that. And now there's this huge culture war that is precisely about, what are these women, these brown women doing to the academy, and Black men, and, everyone who doesn't look like what a historian is supposed to look like. So I think turning to art, or for me, it's been turning to other kinds of like public writing. And I am thinking of like fictional work too, like other kinds of writing, other kinds of expression, where you're still doing your craft as an academic, but in spaces that are not so historically affiliated with state power and what it does. And so there's always going to be that tension when you're an academic. Given the history of the academy, right?
You don't think that tension exists in the art world?
Of course, it exists in every space. Like all of these are, historically shaped in a time of imperialism, right? And are post-colonial too. It's not that you're ever going to find a clean space. It's that one has to be aware, of the passes shaping this, why it's so hard. Like there's a reason it's so hard, right? And maybe when you're in grad school, you think, once I become a professor, I'll have, people listen to me, and it doesn't happen, because you're still you're still, coming from a colonized past. And the university, or whatever space, museum space, or whatever space you're occupying, was built for antithetical purposes, right? And it's not existing to accommodate you. But the story of anti-colonialism is always that it's a permanent struggle, right? You're always pushing back, and anti-colonial activists in the 20th century they were fighting on the front of education, very much like creating new kinds of universities, like Jamia Millia Islamia in Delhi came out of that, right? And there were even like there were many of them were transnational efforts, and so and of course they get co-opted into post-colonial projects too, and so it's meant to be a constant pushback. We're not going to reach like a really happy space where we'll have true freedom. Then there won't be anything to say anyway, right?
Right, and I keep, with your comments, both of you, with Zainab and Priya, I kept thinking about the Gulf and the role of the Gulf in the art world today, and the ways in which they are co-opting the so-called Arab and Islamic arts, and what is allowed and what is not allowed. And I keep thinking about, just in the last few months, the kinds of, huge awards that were given to artists who are supposedly critical of imperialism and of colonialism, and a couple of meetings in the last couple of months as well in Saudi Arabia. Again, a lot of these artists who we would think about as anti-colonial, very aware of the politics of the day, but sort of succumbing to this drive to narrate and to shape what contemporary art is. And again, from the Saudi sort of state perspective, it is an opening to specifically co-opt these artists to make sure that they draw the boundaries of what they can and cannot do. So just, I'm curious, Zainab, how you think about this.
Absolutely. I mean, I think what's going on there is really problematic. And, I haven't worked there, so I clearly have issues with it. But in terms of just museum displays in general, I mean, that's why I mentioned them briefly in my talk. Obviously, this has been going on since the invention of the museum in the West, right? I mean, museums like the Louvre or the British Museum are they're museums of colonial looting, basically. What we have in them is war booty, loot that was taken from imperial wars. So this is very clear that they're not a kind of a neutral space at all. But what I find more disturbing is the current exhibitions that sometimes appear in them are not critical of that, but just kind of reaffirm and repeat the narratives of the 19th century. And that to me is really troubling. With contemporary art, I think there's definitely a co-option going on. So that's something to be worried about. But there are some artists who are not doing that. And I tend to be more interested in the works of those particular artists who are not, in fact, getting involved in that kind of thing. So, I mean, as Priya said, you're never going to find a pure space, but you have to try to do what you can do within what's available and what's possible within your world. And I think that maybe for myself, at least, delving into art practice is in a way easier than for an artist, because I don't have to depend on it. I mean, I am a tenured professor at an Ivy League institution, so I'm just playing with it, really, right? So, I mean, I don't have to make a name for myself or a career for myself. So in that sense, I have more freedom to be critical of certain regimes of knowledge through art practice. Maybe if I were a young artist, I would think differently and, have other problems to confront.
A very quick interruption here, and Priya, I'll give you the mic in just a second. I just want to field the question that we got in the chat from a graduate student, because I think it's important that even though you reflect on your positions and your strategies as scholars, I know that the three of you are also powerful teachers and pedagogues, and so we have a question that is about how do you remain relevant in sort of archive studies and the study of political violence across fields, across history, archaeology, art history. But also I want to add, how do you remain ethical given everything you've told us? Because grad students are now preyed upon with grants, with money, by those very same power that perhaps fund a new modern artist, but they're also going to go after your grad students. So in a sense, would like you to perhaps, Priya, as I'm returning the mic to you, perhaps if you could say something about this.
So what I was going to say before answering that was that I just wanted to maybe this is obvious, but as a reminder that whatever we're doing at the end, I mean, as individuals is one thing, but obviously we cannot mistake what we do, whether as artists or writers, as teachers, as the activism that actually creates change, because that always has to be a much more collective thing. So it's alongside that, and it has its own value and is related to activism, but it isn't a substitute for that. And then the question about grad student, about expertise across different areas, is that kind of the question, Adrien?
Well, in light of the theme we're discussing, in light of both new directions in different fields around archive, past traces and violence, but also ethical dilemmas that we have to face today that perhaps we didn't have to face 10, 20 years ago, how would you advise a grad student who is asking for guidance on this, on how to make decisions, how to pick a topic, how to remain relevant, how to remain ethical indeed?
I think, I don't think you can have calculated answers to that. I mean, it's for me, maybe I'm missing the point, but I just feel if you think very strategically about your topic, you have to have sense, but you should pick something that's genuinely an intellectual. This is why it's not activism, it's intellectual, what we're doing as scholars. So something has to pose a kind of intellectual mystery for you that you're genuinely curious to dig and find out the truth about that thing, or what's going to satisfy you as a truth about that thing, right? So that should be the motivation there. And that you are a product of it, you live in the world, right? So things that are interesting to you are automatically going to be relevant in some way you may not even realize it, right? So I started working on British intelligence in Iraq before 9/11 even happened. I didn't know that it was going to become like super, super relevant, but because I was shaped by my own time. And then it was like this, it felt like, oh my God, what a massive coincidence. I'm working on this. And now we're worried about intelligence. US is worried about intelligence in Iran. It's not a coincidence. It's because I'm a historical being, right? So I don't think you have to consciously worry so much about that. Whatever you do as a historian is always automatically shaped by your present. So it's going to be relevant. And I think it's better not to force that and overthink that, and just to have, especially when you're a grad student, a sense of what you're genuinely intellectually curious about. That's all I would say on that.
Thoughts? We have another question here. Rosie, did you want to jump in? Yes, please.
I can just add to that. You're going, if you stay in the academic field, you're going to be thinking about this for at least 15 years. So it really needs to be something you like, because even as something you like, you're going to get so sick of it, right? So thinking strategically perhaps is good in terms of how difficult the job market is, but you really need to be passionate about a particular topic and excited about it. The ethical component, I think, depends on your field site and what you're actually doing, right? So it's as Priya said, it's hard to give a generic answer to something like that. It is something that I have thought a lot about in my own work. Given I've done work in Saudi Arabia, and that I've done work on specifically the social movements that I've discussed, and I relied on a lot of people to do that. So for me, at least, the ethical came first, right? And I had to change my book quite a bit to make sure, and which weakened the book perhaps in certain ways, but to make sure that nobody would get in trouble. And I was very cognizant of that the whole time I was in Saudi Arabia, the whole few years that I spent there, to not use people to get access to any particular institution or place or archive, and to just venture on my own so that it's never traced to any one person. So there are things you can, of course, do to protect people, especially when you're working in authoritarian states. But I think the ethical should come first, and it will show, I think, a commitment and create trust with people in the site that you're working in, and for scholars as well, who will ultimately help you get what you're trying to study. So for me, at least, the ethical was at the forefront of what I was doing. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful listening to you all engage each other. There's another audience question, and I sort of want to use that to push us a little bit more to talk about the digital technologies that are involved in some of the work that you all are doing. So the question here is, it says, the person has said, even earlier than Iraq was the occupation of the US embassy in Iran in 1979, Edward Said observed that for all of the barrels of ink and tons of newsprint expended on telling that story in US news media, it did little or nothing to build a deeper awareness or understanding among the American public about Iran and or Islam. Is academia the source of a solution to this agnosia, is the question. And you've already been talking about some of the complicities of academia, but I wonder if we can talk a bit about digital technologies and the ways in which they make us complicit, but also the ways in which they can perhaps be used to subvert the kind of dominant paradigm. So, I'm thinking of GPS, mapping, drones, all of this kind of stuff. Want to jump in? I had a question for Zainab as well, but I think she's dropped off. Yeah.
There's a reason why, at least in Middle East studies, where so many of us in our classes have to begin with a critique of Orientalism and Orientalist scholarship until this very day, right? We thought post 9/11, that became much more so the case. Post 2011 Arab uprisings, many scholars of the Middle East thought that finally people in the Middle East were going to be seen as their, as agents of their own history. And we've gone back to having to explain and critique Orientalism because these ideas are just so powerful and entrenched in the knowledge circulating in academic institutions. But to go back to the digital, I mean, I thought that all the presentation touched on that so nicely, and this idea of technology and enlightenment, technology and modernity, ideas that we have, for example, about digitization and democracy, I think for me is a big one. I often get this comment that, you know, now we're digitizing our archives and records. It's going to be accessible to everybody around the world. This is a moment where knowledge is becoming democratic. And I'll just say a very short story about even meeting at a conference at Mesa, an archivist from the British Library who was working on the collaboration with the Qatar Library, and who was quite upset about how the Qataris were vetting documents. And, you know, calling on us academics to intervene with the Qatari government. And I thought it was cute that this person thought that academics have any power of that sort. But I also thought it was duplicitous in ways that, you know, the British Library does this all the time. The British Library has burned collections on former colonies, specifically to hide some of the, you know, violence that the British imperial powers have committed in these colonies. So again, the digitization to me has been, the discourse around that and democratization is so superficial. In fact, what digitization in my experience has done is to allow archivists and, you know, those decision makers who in fact don't usually know everything they have in their collection to see what there is and to allow some things to be digitized and made accessible and others not. So in my understanding, it has made policing of records even more efficient.
Do you think that it has shifted, you know, our understanding of what constitutes knowledge and what it means to be known now, because we have different visualities from the drone, the view from nowhere that Zainab was speaking about, but also the kind of mass digitization allows for a different kind of analytic. So I that's what I'm wondering. And Priya, with respect to your work, I mean, you're studying, you know, covert operations. And so I'm wondering, I mean, there's archives for some stuff, but I'm wondering how you deal with the unknowable as a category, things that we just there's no way of finding out, and sort of how do you manage that in your work?
I think, you know, and I actually encountered that more when I was working on my second book, when I worked on the 18th century and the nature of sources from that era. Just makes you much more aware of gaps and just information loss as endemic to human life, and that we're always dealing with traces. And that's why we're never done with a topic. New things come to light and there's no final word on it. For me, you know, like Rosie was saying, I mean, whenever you're dealing with an archive, you're already dealing with an ethically dubious, a set of materials, a technology that's already ethically dubious in its origins, right? Like she was saying about the British National Archives are crafted, they were created to support a certain version of history, right? And so that's why we read against the grain or we supplement with oral histories. If you think of what, you know, Carolyn Elkins did in telling the story of Kenya in the 1950s, right? So, you know, that's part of our work. And I think that's why I guess if I could add one thing to my earlier response about, or non-response, I guess, about ethics, is that I do feel the right approach, that there is a right approach to doing history, given the way history has served power before. I do think there is an obligation to have an anti-colonial purpose in your work. That doesn't mean everyone's going to do that, but that is like, if I had to give advice, I would say approach all archives, all technologies with that attitude and that kind of suspicion and skepticism going in, right? So I think that is required given what we know about the discipline's past. Just like we have to read an archive against the grain, you have to be a historian against the grain of what history has always been. To me, that means you're required to be anti-colonial. Since we're almost done, I just want to say one thing. I realized I said a typo in my talk. I said I visited the Air Force bases in 2003, which doesn't make any sense. It was 2013. It's been bugging me that I said that wrong in the recording. Anyway, just wanted that on the record in case this gets planted on YouTube or something. Okay.
So yeah, I wonder what you think about what digitization of records has done to the idea of traces.
Well, I think you can get overly confident, right? Like sometimes it's just really convenient, like during COVID, you know, when you couldn't travel and you could have digital access, that's great, you have something. But I think it may not trigger the kind of skepticism or awareness of holes that you would have if you were materially in the archive and looking in the way you open boxes and find things, right? Like, so I think that is a little worrying. And I think that's something as teachers, we need to really make our students aware of, like what's different about working with digital sources, and that it's like when you find a book, you know, online versus finding it in the stacks. And when you find it in the stacks, you find it in the context of so many other things, and you're much more aware of the whole process of how that, you know, where that book fits in reality, right? So I mean, just that the contextual apparatus of research, you know, is lost when everything is digitized, being in the archive aspect. And so that is something we have to consistently teach. And I don't know how aware every teacher is of that, but I guess in platforms like this, it's an opportunity to raise awareness about the need to do so.
And also the mediation of the archivist, right? There no longer is the interaction with the archivist. And I know that so many of my most important documents were actually suggested by archivists as opposed to me finding them in a random box and that sort of thing.
So
yeah.
Is that, in a sense, I mean, digitization in a sense dislocates, I think, right, the archive from its place, and it's. I'm thinking about it in parallel to the stolen archives question, that what is it to approach these archives suddenly in New York or in Paris instead of in their other locations, and it transforms, I imagine, the trace that you can find there and what it is an archive of.
Oh my God, yeah, like our South Asia archivist at Stanford, he's, you know, he gets these opportunities to buy entire sets of, this is not just for digitized, this is actual archival documents, to buy them in like Pakistan and India. And is it ethical to, you know, relocate those at Stanford? And I mean, he doesn't think so. And I also agree that no, I mean, but again, not everyone is going to have the same attitude. And that's why it's so connected to the process of looting, and this idea that, you know, the Parthenon, the Elgin marbles are safer in England, and, you know, archival documents are safer in England. I mean, it's part of the same mentality, right? This is what I'm saying about the historical discipline being like a technology, or whatever you want to call it, of empire. And so if we're doing it, we have to do it with that anti-colonial attitude. And there's no guarantee that that everyone is doing that at all, right? It's a battleground in and of itself, I feel. I don't know, Rosie, what do you think?
Completely agreed.
As a way perhaps to set one last question, we wanted to address, you know, perhaps one last aspect of trace, which is identity as a trace that you wear and that is visible. And I can imagine that you two went to archives and people projected certain assumptions on what you were doing and why you were doing it. And so, in a sense, we'd like to know more about looking a certain way and doing research in this particular point in time. And also, I think another thing that we had in mind with regards to this is perhaps sometimes within the physical setup of an archive, these either racialized or gendered assumptions about people or can be expressed spatially. And we wanted to know if you had particular stories that we could share with our audience that we could in turn share with our students. Thank you.
I think this also touches on the ethical issue as well, and how you frame your project in particular places. I mean, you can't, I couldn't go to Saudi Arabia and say, I'm writing a history of, I couldn't say that. So how do you frame it? Are there ethical ways of framing it? Whether it's to access archives or to do oral histories with people or interview people, right? There's that very important question. I think the identity question is a very important one, because given how we are perceived, we may or may not get access, or we may get access to a lot of records. So my experience in Saudi Arabia, I was initially read as a US citizen coming from an Ivy League institution, and the access I got was quite spectacular. It took them about 10 months to realize that I was, in fact, not a US citizen and from Lebanon. And I started to see doors shut very quickly. But even in the, and at least in one archive, not in all archives, but I should say that, whether perceived as a US citizen or a Lebanese citizen, I had more access to the archives than Saudis themselves did. Right, again, to think about the ethical issue here, Saudis were allowed, and there was a gender dynamic as well, or differentiation. Saudis generally were allowed into the archive for a couple of days. If they were doing their PhDs in Saudi Arabia, their advisor oftentimes told them what they could write on. And so they would go to the archive, spend 2 days there, get some records, and write a dissertation about that. And I oftentimes encountered Saudis who were complaining that they simply would not let them access the archive for more than 2 days. With men, I saw that in specific archives, they could access them a bit more, but still, you couldn't just go for a few months if that's what you wanted to do. So I think the identity issue is a very important one that we should consider.
Last thoughts, Priya?
Yeah, I mean, I mostly researched in the UK and in India, and then in the US. And I talked about my experience. For me, visiting Creech Air Force Base was research, and I described how that went very badly. Like they treated me with more suspicion, I think, than it was weird. It was very uncomfortable. And in India, I've had instances where I found documents and then I go back to look at them and they're suddenly gone. And I don't know if that's because of who I was, or they thought I was Indian and then I turn out to be American, or some issue. I actually don't know. I've always, you never know, like, I don't know, when you grow up as an immigrant in a white society, like you never, I guess I'm just sort of used to not being sure what, I don't know how I read or what people assume, or, but you always know something is happening, but sometimes it's hard to put your finger on it. There's I know that at the National Archives in Britain, it's very robotic and machine-like, the way the archives work, very impersonal. And I actually didn't find archivists who could help me, though I tried. And so I wound up just getting ordering mounds and mounds of files, and so it was very unmediated. And I feel like I'm not saying anything very helpful, except that I think it matters, but I haven't, except for that time at Creech, I can't like say, I didn't have like an aha moment, but yeah, and I'm really sorry, but I have to go now, but it was really nice to talk to all of you, and thank you for your questions, and bye-bye.
Yeah. Thank you so much. We're just actually going to be closing now. So we'd like to thank our panelists for joining us. We'd also like to thank our audience, and we want to thank several faculty members, including Manan Ahmed, Marwa Elshakry, and Brinkley Messick, who have co-organized this series with us. Technologies of Power has been made possible with the support of the Dean of Humanities, Columbia University, as well as the Center for the Study of Muslim Societies, the Departments of History and Anthropology, and the Middle East Institute, and of course, through the support of our current home institutions, Arizona State University and the University of Toronto. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Madiha. Thank you, Adrien, for having me. This was wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
You
Thank you for joining us.
Take care.
take care. Bye.